So there's a YouTube channel I really like called MajorSamm. He makes videos that are basically about a certain conflict and then puts a song that is relating to the conflict a lot of the time in the background. It's a really awesome channel and I recommend you check it out. Now his latest video was called The House of Orange and featured a song by an artist called Stan Rogers of the same name. And of course I'm thinking The House of Orange, that must of course be relating to But actually the song and the video aren't directly relating to the Netherlands at all. Instead, they look at a conflict taking place in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, of course, is the part of the island of Ireland that remained with the United Kingdom, as opposed to the Republic of Ireland in the south, which became independent in 1922. Although this was the state of affairs between the two countries, there were some who were unhappy with this, and this led to a period of violence from 1969 to 1998, known colloquially as the Troubles. Broadly speaking, this was a period of violence between different segments of the community, one which wished to join with the Republic of Ireland and was largely Catholic and Republican, fighting against another who wished to remain within the United Kingdom, both undertaking paramilitary action, and the British Army that started off being between the two became a target of both at various points in the conflict. But what has this got to do with the House of Orange? Why is this being involved, this 17th century king, with a 20th century conflict? The shortest story starts in 1688. The longest version of the story starts in 1169, so we're going to start in 1609. Now 1169 is important because this is the date of the Norman invasion of Ireland, and for centuries afterwards, parts of Ireland would be ruled by the English who were ever seeking to expand their power, and other parts would continue to hold out and would be held by the Irish aristocracy. Now, during the reign of James I of England and VI of Scotland, that's one man king of both England and Scotland, he brought both to bear. This was because Ireland was continually rebelling against his rule and his efforts to expand English and Scottish power over the rest of the island. And so in 1609, he decided to embark on a plan that would become known as the Ulster plantation. James removed from their land the native Irish population and had them replaced with English and Scottish Protestants, many of them Presbyterian, adhering to a very strict form of Protestantism, in the process dispossessing the Irish and instead settling it with those who would be thankful for his intervention. And the two groups would continue to live side by side, but with growing tension as there was difference in language, difference in culture, and crucially for this time, difference in religion too. Tensions came to a head in 1641 when neighbouring England split into the English Civil War, dividing those between those loyal to the King, Charles I, and those loyal to Parliament. In Ireland this also occurred, but there was actually a rebellion from the Catholics who were loyal to the Royalist standard, which seems a little confusing, but that's because their Protestant neighbours were owing their allegiance to the parliamentarians. And this led to, in Ireland, the Irish Confederate Wars, where about 2/3 of Ireland came under the control of the Irish Confederacy of Catholics, and they fought against often the Covenanters coming in from Scotland and the Protestant militias, largely in the north, owing to the Ulster plantation. Now in 1649 it had gone really downhill for the Royalists in England, and so Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the parliamentarian army, decided that with King Charles executed, he could invade Ireland. He did so with ruthless efficiency and destroyed the Irish Confederacy, killing around 500,000 Irishmen at the same time, although some of these will be from disease and famine and other factors. This came partially because Oliver Cromwell was a strong Presbyterian and hated the Catholic faith. After his victory in Ireland, he had everyone executed who was part of the 1641 rebellion. Catholicism was banned, Catholics were not allowed to live in towns, those who had land as well were forced into this small region highlighted in green of Connacht, and so those Irishmen who owned land went from 60% of holding land in Ireland to just 8% after Cromwell had taken power there. 12,000 of the Irish were also sold into indentured servitude, which is a condition similar to slavery in the West Indies, while a further 34,000 are thought to have left of their own accord. Meanwhile, some 12,000 veterans from the new model army that Cromwell had used to destroy the Royalists in both England, Scotland, and then in Ireland were also granted land to settle on in Ireland. And although not all of them did actually take it, those they sold them to were also Protestant, and they kept their arms. There's also the case of several of the Scottish Covenanters coming and settling on Irish land, and once again that involved taking the land forcibly from the Irish Catholic tenants, which they could do under Cromwell's regime. In 1660, things started to look up for Ireland's Catholics, because returning from his exile in the Netherlands was another Charles. This was Charles II, the son of the executed king, who came and took power and ended the short-lived English Commonwealth and the tyranny of Cromwell. Now, when he arrived, he did actually restore some of the land to the Irish Catholic aristocracy, and this brought the number of the actual Catholic Irish who were owning land back up to 20%, but of course that's a much smaller figure than the 60% they had before the Cromwellian invasions, and tensions continued to be very high between the Protestant and Catholic populations who had killed each other indiscriminately. In England and Scotland, where the vast majority of the population were Protestant, there was widespread fear of a Catholic takeover, so in 1673 Parliament passed the Test Act, which basically meant that anyone taking a military or civil office had to swear off parts of the Catholic ceremony, the transubstantiation, which basically meant that Catholics were barred from these positions. Now, one person who did not take this act was the brother of King Charles, James, Duke of York, the reason being that he himself was a Catholic. Now, he actually gave up his role as the High Admiral of the Royal Navy, something I've talked about before in my video about how New Amsterdam became New York, and so outed himself as a Catholic, which he'd been since 1668. And this, of course, was a great worry for the majority Protestant population. They saw a king coming back as being Catholic. They'd heard the stories of Mary burning Protestants alive and what was happening in France and other places, and so they feared a similar thing as had happened in Ireland before would happen in England and Scotland. Taking a keen interest in these events from across the channel was Willem Hendrik, the Stadthouder of the Dutch Republic. Now, this was a position that Willem Hendrik had almost never held. And this is because in 1654, when he'd been just 4 years old, his family, the House of Orange, had been dispossessed. It was one of the parts of the treaty signed with the English after their defeat in the First Anglo-Dutch War that said that the House of Orange would not be allowed to become Stadthouder, basically the rulers of the Dutch Republic. And this became the first Stadthouderless period of the Dutch Republic. But in 1672, everything had changed. In this year, known as het rampjaar, in Dutch the disaster year, the Dutch Republic was invaded by the English, the French, and various German states. They made quick gains, and soon the Dutch were confined to just Holland, having lost most of the provinces outside and the key fortresses therein. But within Holland, Willem managed to take power and managed to rally the Dutch forces against the onslaught and was slowly able to turn the tide. At sea as well, he was aided by the genius of Michiel de Ruyter, winning many famous sea battles against the English and their French allies, forcing the English out of the war and eventually pushing the French out and saving the Dutch Republic from what it seemed an absolutely catastrophic state. This made Willem not just a little bit of a hero in the Dutch Republic. The reason Willem took such a key interest into the politics in England is because the French who had attacked him had been Catholic. And should James, which was potentially quite likely, become King of England and also a Catholic, it might once again create a kind of scenario as had been the case in 1672, from which his nation had barely escaped alive. And so it was in Willem's best interests to make sure that a Protestant remained on the throne in England. Therefore, he proposed to marry the daughter of Duke James, Princess Mary, an idea which James did not like, but under pressure from his brother and still King Charles II, was forced to accept. So now the would-be Catholic successor to the throne of England had an heir, the Princess Mary, that was married to a Protestant, Willem van Oranje. On 1685, on the death of Charles, James became James II of England and 7th of Scotland. And his reign got off to a rocky start. There were two rebellions during this year. One was led by the Duke of Monmouth, and another was led in Scotland by the Duke of Argyll. This was a Covenanter rising against his rule. And though he was able to militarily quash both, it soon became clear, had been supported and had left from the Dutch Republic. So his stepson clearly was not a very big fan of James. And this is the reason that he actually increased the size of the army and started recruiting, but really this message actually sent to the people that he was planning something and they weren't a fan of what he was doing, although arguably you could say he was justified because he'd faced against these rebellions. In Scotland, James made matters worse because he introduced new penal codes that were particularly tolerant towards rebelling Catholics, but against the Presbyterians, so like the Covenanters, they were incredibly harsh. And so this became known as the killing time for the Covenanters of Scotland. In Ireland, he actually officially appointed a lieutenant that was openly Catholic, Sir Richard Talbot, and of course this did nothing to allay the fears of the Protestants within Ireland as well as the other kingdoms. It was in England, however, that things would really come to a head with the Parliament and with the Church, as in 1688, a year after having first released the Declaration of Indulgence, but now once again trying to get it through by cramming Parliament full of his supporters. This essentially was an act that decriminalised Catholicism and dissenting Protestant voices. Today we might see this as actually a really good thing. It allowed for more opinions and more tolerance for these different religious groups, but back then it was seen as a gateway through which Catholicism could leap, and so people went up in arms. However, there was insult to injury, as this had to be read by all Anglican ministers throughout the kingdom. And 7 bishops, they stood up in opposition to this, and they were then tried by the court and given very harsh sentences. And this actually led very much into the fear of what was coming next, because actually he and his wife gave birth to a child that would become a Catholic ruler. And actually beforehand it had not been too bad, because the 2 daughters of James, Mary and Anne, Mary of course being married to William, they were both Protestant, but now this child would be raised a Catholic, and so there was a future for a Catholic dynasty. And 7 nobles decided then to take matters into their own hands, fearing this Catholic future, and wrote a letter to Willem van Oranje over in the Dutch Republic, asking him to assemble an army and to invade. And this he would do in what's become known as the Glorious Revolution. With an invasion force at his back, Willem landed in the south of England and started to march towards London. Upon his landing, many of the English nobles switched sides and pledged their allegiance to Willem. James soon fled the capital, throwing the Great Seal of the realm into the River Thames, and made his way to Kent, where he was captured by Dutch forces, although they allowed him to go and he fled to France. Now in the meantime, the Parliament in England had said that because he'd thrown the Great Seal into the River Thames and had fled, that he'd given up the right to rule, and that Willem instead would become king. However, over in Ireland, they decided that James was the rightful king. Now, of course, many in Ireland were Catholic. They had been supporters of his and of the more tolerant policies he was bringing in towards Catholics, and so had no desire for another Protestant king. So the Parliament in Ireland upheld the right of James to rule, while the Parliaments in England and Scotland were now vying for William. And so this is how the Williamite War began in Ireland. Now notice that the Irish name there actually is the War of the Two Kings. And this is because the Irish, of course, had seen one king. Of course, the Protestants in Ireland were seeing William as their king, being Protestant, and the Catholics were seeing James as being their rightful king. And so conflict erupted between this new army in Ireland, the army that had remained loyal to James, starting fights against the Protestant militia that were protecting the Protestant areas there. Now this would lead to various sieges in the north. Remember, the north was where most of the Protestants had been settled during the Ulster plantation, so places like Derry, Belfast and others were coming under siege from these forces. In 1689, James came back from France with several thousand French troops being supplied by Louis. They would link up with the various Irish forces that had remained loyal to him in Ireland, and so they would try to use this as a base from which to attack England. But Willem as well would enter Ireland to fight back against James and to secure the crown once and for all. He would have his Dutch as well as some Danish and from other parts of the continent forces with him, as well as the English army from England that had switched sides to his, and so the two forces would come head to head in battle. This would occur one of the largest times in 1690 at the Battle of the Boyne. Willem and the Williamites had a larger army to bear against the Jacobites, and almost 60,000 men took part during the battle, although only a few thousand were to die. The Dutch Blue Guards played an important role crossing the ford, although Jacobite cavalry kept them pinned down. In the end, it was the order to retreat and the hasty fleeing of the King James himself that led to the defeat of the Jacobites and the ultimate victory of the Williamites in the battle. However, at the time, it did not seem to be a significant victory, because the next day, an Anglo-Dutch fleet was defeated by the French at Beachy Head. Not long afterwards in Scotland, the Jacobites there, under the command of Bonnie Dundee, the Viscount of Dundee, won a great victory against a larger force of the Covenanters at the Battle of Killiecrankie, although ultimately the Jacobite cause in Scotland would be lost as Dundee was killed during the battle, and they subsequently were defeated by the Covenanters there too. But by 1691, James had fled back to France, and following the defeat of the remaining Jacobites at the Battle of Aughrim, a much more decisive victory for the Williamites, it became clear that William and, let's say, the Protestant side had defeated the Catholic king. And so the date of the Battle of Aughrim, not the Battle of the Boyne, the 12th of July, became a celebrated day. The reason this switched is because, of course, in 1752 they switched calendars from the Gregorian, and therefore the dates changed, which actually aligned with the Battle of the Boyne, and so now it's really the Battle of the Boyne that gets the praise on the 12th among certain communities in Northern Ireland. As I said, James already fled back to France and from there would continue his efforts. Particularly in Scotland, these would become well known. During 1715, his son, the Old Pretender, would come and try to reclaim his throne, with subsequent risings in England and in Scotland, and more famously, the Jacobite Rising of 1745 would be the grandson of James II, Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, would attempt for the last time to fight the Stuart cause, although ultimately they would prove unsuccessful, and this in turn would lead to the depopulation of the Highlands and much of the emigration that left the Scottish Highlands for places around the world today. But in Ireland it wasn't quite so clear what happened straight away. What did eventually become clear is that the Protestant king, William, although of course he was a Dutch king, not a Northern Irish king, had won, and the Catholic king had lost. And for this reason, it's taken that this was a great victory for the Protestants, and that the colour orange, of course, his family, the House of Orange, became a very important colour for the Protestants, who felt that if he had not won that victory, they would have been massacred by the Catholic Irish, who at that time had been quite successful in fighting them. And ultimately, it gave its name to the Orange Order and features prominently on their flags and on their murals and other things that you can still see in Northern Ireland today, or if you go and see one of their marches. Now, of course, during the period of Ireland, this is not the end of the story of the Troubles in Ireland, and actually a lot of the subsequent developments are incredibly important, but this is the story of Willem van Oranje, of William of Orange, as he's often sort of incorrectly known in English. There were statues of him that were erected around a lot of Ireland because for the Protestants he became a big hero, like this one in Dublin, which you can no longer see because of course when Dublin became independent as part of the capital of Republic of Ireland in 1922, they did not want to commemorate the loss of who many saw as a hero for the Catholic Irish. But in Northern Ireland, he continues to be an important figure in certain communities. And this, I think, is why in 1983, Stan Rogers was writing his song, this protest song about the Troubles. He decided to call it the House of Orange. The one thing that might strike you, however, is that Stan Rogers was Canadian. He wasn't Irish. So why was he singing about the Troubles and the conflict in Northern Ireland? Well, this is because actually during this time, the IRA and other underground movements, and even some of the Protestant ones in Protestant communities, went out to some of these expatriate communities of the Irish. Remember how so many of the Irish were sent away to become indentured servants and left of their own accord? Well, that wasn't the only time that happened in Irish history. And at many times, in many great peaks, including after the Irish potato famine, many Irishmen left Ireland for places like the United States and Canada. And when the Troubles erupted in the late 60s and through the 70s, 80s and 90s, they needed funding to continue their war against the British and others in Northern Ireland. And a large place where they got funding was actually expatriate Irish communities in the United States and in Canada. And actually, if you listen to the lyrics of the song, this is the last verse of the song The House of Orange, then you can really get a sense. It's people going out and trying to get money, get funds for these Republican movements, many of them that were considered to be terrorists by various governments around the world and who carried out terror attacks. They were trying to fundraise them in the United States and Canada. And the song is basically him saying that he has forgiven the House of Orange, he's forgiven King Billy, so King William, which has then also become a synonym for the Protestants in Ireland because of their taking on the sort of the colour of orange and the symbolism of orange as they're standing against Catholics, that he's forgiven that and won't be contributing his money to what was a great tragedy of a conflict that is still arguably ongoing in many ways to this day. Anyway, I thought this was a really interesting topic. It's a really beautiful song. I hadn't heard it before, but I thought it was really great, and I will leave a link to that in the description below if you want to have a listen and have a watch of the footage yourself. This video did go on quite a bit, but I thought it was worth exploring the backstory properly because there's quite a lot of it there. But do let me know if you found it interesting. I haven't uploaded properly in a little while, but I'm going to be trying to upload every week once again to get into a bit of a good schedule with that once again. But yes, it's great to be back. I hope everyone is doing well. Thank you very much for watching. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you are new, and I will see you soon.